Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the main session of Japan SciComm Forum. Hope you had a good workshop. And we will get going with our panel discussion just now. So we have 4 panelists, and this workshop or this session was coordinated by Ayako Miyazaki of Springer Nature. So thank you to them for organizing this. We have panel discussion on finding the story and the differences between public relations and journalism. And we're going to get those people spotlighted on our screen now. I will stop sharing and let Sara Phillips, the panel moderator, take over. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Japan SciComm Forum. Today we have, oh, look, we're in a virtual room. That's very exciting. Today we have with us Nicky Phillips, who is no relation of me. I'm Sara Phillips. We have Tomoko Otake and we have Belinda Smith. I'm going to let each of you do your own introduction. Will be far more efficient than I will be, but I'll briefly kick off with me. My name's Sara Phillips. I am the regional editor of Nature Research Custom Media for the Asia Pacific region, or at least I was until very recently, but I am still contracting to Springer Nature in that role. And we have also with us Nicky. Nicky, could you very quickly introduce yourself? You're muted. You're still muted, Nicky.
We can't hear you.
All right, let's go to Belinda Smith. Belinda, could you introduce yourself while we're figuring out what's with Nicky's audio?
Sure thing. Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Hi, I'm Belinda Smith. I'm the online science reporter with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which means I write news and features for online, but I also produce news stories and radio features for Radio National. So Nicky, how are you going? Are you able to unmute now?
Yeah, sorry about that. Do you want me to go, Sara?
Nicky, you haven't figured out how Zoom works, Nicky.
I know, you can tell I've been on maternity leave, can't you? Hi everyone, I'm Nicky Phillips. I'm the Asia Pacific Bureau Chief for Nature News. And yeah, I've been on maternity leave for the last 7 months, looking after my little son, Theo. So yeah, really excited to be here.
Hello, can you hear me? Great. My name is Tomoko Otake. I'm a public relations officer at the University of Tokyo. I joined the university about 3 years ago, and before that, I was a newspaper journalist at the Japan Times in Tokyo for over 2 decades. Thank you.
So let's start with Belinda, because you are perhaps the most standard, shall we say, of science journalists. Talk us through, if you can, what it's like to be a journalist in that role. How do you interact with press officers who are trying to tell you their stories?
Yes, so as you might imagine, I get loads of press releases, a lot of press officers getting in touch with me every day. And I mean, I do look at them, but it's always a very quick skim. Because often we'll see the big stories, the must covers in the journals, in the embargoed journal releases that come out, like Nature's. And but occasionally there will be something that kind of slips through that you know, we don't see through the journals. And yeah, I mean, I know plenty of science journalists who just don't bother with press releases, but we in the ABC tend to. Yeah, look at them all. I mean, look, 99% of the time, it just doesn't, you know, they just kind of wash over us. But there is like the occasional little nugget of gold that we just have to pan out. And I can understand it would be very hard for press officers to have to fight their way through all that noise, because we just do get inundated with so much stuff.
In some on some level, the stuff that comes out of the journals is in effect a press release as well. Effectively, you're promoting the journal Nature when you're reporting on some paper that's been published in Nature. How do you decide, even if you're just looking at the releases of what's coming out in the journals, how do you decide which one is the story?
Because we can cover everything, but we just have a finite number of hours in the day, and I would like to have a life outside of work. So we spend maybe a total of about 2 hours a week, maybe spread over 3 meetings in the science unit. So there's about 8 journos, and we talk about the stories that we're going to cover in the next week or couple of days or whatever might spring up. So that's where we sort of coordinate within the science unit. And then we also coordinate into the ABC more broadly, because there might be regional science stories. So there might be a story that comes out of Brisbane that the Brisbane journos might pick up, or from the Kimberley and the WA journos might pick that up. So it's about sort of coordinating within our little pocket and then throughout the entire kind of ABC itself as well. But when we're selecting what stories we want to choose, because we're the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, anything with an Australian focus is pretty much going to be pretty high on the list. Even if it's something that's got maybe an Australian historical perspective, maybe an Australian author is involved in the paper, but it might have been done primarily overseas. Any kind of Australian angle is really important to us and to the audience as well. So that's something we always keep front of mind when we're choosing stories too.
Nicky, you're different because you're working within Nature. Do you feel any sort of obligation to promote the papers that are coming out in Nature as part of the Nature News? And I should explain perhaps for the audience, just in case they're not aware, that Nature is sort of a complicated journal. In the back half is all the scientific papers that are published each week, and the front half is almost like a normal magazine. It's Nature News at the front half. So Nicky, you work for front half. How do you determine what you're going to be publishing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say no, there is no pressure at all for us to cover the science in the Nature Journal. In fact, the two parts of the business are quite separate, in that the journalism team work very separately from the science journal side. Although we do cover research that's published in Nature, but we'd be doing it based on it meeting the news values that we're looking for in every story that we decide to cover. So I mean, I'm an editor, so primarily I am being pitched stories by either the reporters that work for Nature or freelancers. And when they come to me, I'm thinking, well, is this story something that our audience needs to know or would want to know? So always in the back of my mind is this piece of news something for our audience? And at Nature News, we consider our audience to be working scientists, as well as the science interested public. But primarily we see our core audience as scientists, which makes us a little bit different from Belinda, in that your, Belinda, correct me if I'm wrong, core audience is the public. So that's something that we think about when it comes to deciding stories, is how would this be relevant or important to scientists working in the field. The other things I'm looking for is it timely and is it current? So if we're talking about journal stories, we'd want it to have come out recently, like we publish a story on the day that it comes out of the journal, the day the embargo lifts, I mean. Also looking for, is it significant and surprising? So that's where we'd be deciding whether a paper is worth covering in Nature or any of the other journals. Is this a significant finding? Is it surprising? We don't want to cover things that are just incremental. You know, there's a lot of journals out there, there's a lot of science going on. We're a small team, so we have to be really judicious in which stories we decide to cover from the journals, or any story. You know, we cover a lot of stories that aren't, the origin doesn't come from a journal, but we have the same news values for all of them.
a little bit about news values just then, and also about, you know, surprising and original kind of work. Can you talk us through what those news values are and how they help inform your selection?
Yeah, okay. So a couple of the news values that we consider important would be, you know, is science related, obviously, because our like I said, our audience is scientists. So, you know, if it's a journal article in Nature or Science or Cell, then it's obviously science related, so it ticks that box. But if it's a big worldwide event, something like a tsunami, we'd be thinking, what is the science angle to this story if we were going to cover it? So yeah, so that's how we'd think of that. I was saying before, we want it to be timely. So I probably wouldn't, we wouldn't want to publish something that's a month old or 6 months old. It would be something that's happening now or in the future or has recently happened. Maybe the exception is if it hadn't been covered before, and it was something really important, a really big science, maybe a science scandal that happened a year ago, then we would consider covering it because it meets one of those other important values in that it's significant for scientists and it's science related. I guess the other news value I think about a lot is significance and surprising. So if something big has happened in a field, we wouldn't want it to be just a small, you know, moving a discovery on a little bit. We'd want it to be quite significant for us to cover it.
Counter to how most of science works. I mean, most of science is incremental discoveries, and it's very rare that you have these breakthroughs. I mean, people use the word breakthroughs, but rarely are they real breakthroughs. Most of the time it's incremental achievement. So is it the case then that for the news outlets like you and Belinda, I think you're probably on the same page here, you just don't cover the incremental developments?
For us, it sort of depends. If it's a study that maybe has been done in humans for the first time, but it's, you know, that's the next step up from all the preclinical models, we might cover that. But then with these incremental ones, you want to put it in a greater context. So you're not just report, and this is the same with all the papers that we report on. You're not just reporting on the result, but you're placing that result in the wider story. So I think you can report on incremental, or we do report on some incremental results, but as long as they're within a larger tale that tells more of the story, those increments aren't just broken down and passed, they're part of a chunkier kind of piece. I think, yeah, that's something that we do. But I mean, I totally get it. Like, I mean, the way we select stories is very similar. It's got to have that novelty. It's got to be current for those kinds of news stories for sure, and finding those science angles in other places too. Yeah.
I'll move over to you. You have quite a different role. You worked as a journalist for the Japan Times, and so of course everybody here, you're familiar with the experience of both Nicky and Belinda, but now you're working as a journalist exclusively for the University of Tokyo. Could you describe how that works? What is the job that you have at the University of Tokyo?
Thank you. My main job is to create research features bilingually for the university's website, called, like a news site called Otake Focus, and other publications. And I get stories in a similar way somehow, in that I try to find interesting stories to cover. I try interesting people to feature through all kinds of like means. But of course, like being a university media, it's, you know, different in many ways from regular news media. So like there are two ways. Like sometimes like I get like an assignment, like a news reporter would. So I would get like, for example, like the university wants to promote more diversity and inclusion in its membership and policies and campus environment, for example. So I was asked to put together a package content that promotes like researchers doing diversity and inclusion research, for example. And so I would do all kinds of research, read, the web stuff on magazine, newspaper articles and stuff to come up with a list of researchers that would make an interesting package for the feature. Or like, and then like the bottom-up approach where I would basically just do my own research to come up with an interesting list of people to interview. And like, for example, I was reading a book on like right-wing novelist. I mean, I actually do humanities research features as well. So I was reading a book on like a right-wing novelist in Japan for my private reading, and would come up a reference on like a researcher who researches like online right-wingers, for example. And then I would just Google them, Google her name, and like read for books, and then like go on and ask for an interview from her. So those things. If that answers your question.
Yeah. And so working for a university, we talked about the incremental nature of science just now. Are you asked to make fairly incremental science interesting? Are you asked to report on science whether or not you feel it has the news values that would typically be required to get a story into a newspaper?
Yeah, it was one recent case where I was kind of like casually asked whether I would be interested in interviewing a chemist who, researches like the molecular movements of molecules and like how different movements of like ions can lead to creation of energy. But like it was a very technical field, and his research is very incremental. But what I try to do is, because I write features, not press releases, I can kind of focus on the person behind the research more. So I can try to do like a human interest story. And so that way I can get something interesting out of that person rather than focus on one piece of research. That's usually the approach I take, like whenever I interview a person on campus, I approach the interviewee as if I were writing a profile, even if, end product might not be a profile. So I would try to kind of like do a human interest story, and I would try to find out, like do a lot of advanced reading and research, and always like check out like their CV to kind of see how the person has led their lives, and kind of follow their life events like chronologically before actually getting to the research. Of course, I would ask about the research and their future plans and all that, but like I would always like do kind of like investigative work, and that way, like the person, the researcher becomes more personable and understandable and relatable, I think.
Because a lot of people think that science journalism should focus on science. It's in the name, but you're speaking there about actually drawing out the human element of the research that you're talking about in your stories. Why do you think it's important to draw upon that human element?
Well, first of all, like every media has a different audience. I feel that the university media has a particular audience, and it's somebody who might be interested in like maybe studying at the university, or like researching at the university, working at the university, or like collaborating or donating to the university. So those are our like main audience, right? And I think the piece of research, whatever that is, needs to be relatable to that person. So human interest is a very good way to make the research relatable, I think. But also, I understand that, for example, like when we're like interviewing a female researcher, for example, I wouldn't like, write about like, so what's it like, balancing your work and life, work-life balance, for example, what it's like, raising a child or whatever. Like I wouldn't put that in I would try to avoid that kind of stuff because I would like to treat everybody as a professional, of course. But yeah, I don't think you need to just like focus on the piece of research to make a story interesting. So that's why I do it that way.
I'm going to open this, I guess, to everybody who's here, but what I'm interested in is that with scientific paper, you know, you've got your abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion. How much, when you're writing up a piece of research, do you focus on each of those areas? How much do you follow the format of a scientific paper? And how much do you throw it completely away and have a completely different structure when you're approaching science journalism? Anyone can jump in. I know you've all got the same answer.
I'll go first. I just, I don't like, how I write changes with each story. So, and it never follows the scientific paper abstract type sort of situation. I really don't know until after I've interviewed my talent how the story is going to vaguely be structured or end up looking like. I'm really guided by what I get out of my interviewees and the research and all the other stuff that happens in the background. So that's, nothing like scientific paper.
No.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the thing about a scientific paper is usually it starts with the background. So in a news story, you usually start with the news, and often in a scientific paper that's buried in the results and the discussion. You know, there might be a line in the abstract. The abstract is a little bit more, no, it's not really like a news story, but the abstract is short and usually the results are in there. Well, not usually, the results are in there. And so that's usually what you're leading with in a news story. Some reporters like to have this thing called an anecdotal lead, where it's sort of a softer lead that maybe starts with the person, the scientist, or a case study, a person that's somehow been affected by what you're writing about, but the news is in the first paragraph, which isn't what happens with a scientific paper.
On the chat line that there is in fact many questions, so let's go over to the people who are watching and who have their questions. There are lots of questions. I don't know where to start. Let's start here. Tomoko, for Tomoko, this question is, does the researcher have editorial input into their feature? Some of them want to focus on their science and they don't really want to get the human element involved.
I guess I have been really fortunate. I never really encountered a researcher who said no to the idea of me, like, you know, doing a research feature instead of like a research story. I guess I've been fortunate. I usually try to show the stuff that I've published before, so people have an idea of the length and the presentation that we used on our web stories. And people are generally, I mean, some people, I try to focus, I try to like showcase researchers who are not so much in the media yet, you know, because people who are a lot in the media have like the other outlets, I think, but like people who have never been like introduced by the media before, sometimes they're not really used to talking to anyone. So like when I try to get like interesting answers out of them, like they can talk for 5 minutes or something, like I can't stop. And the interview gets like, you know, like 3 hours instead of an hour. But that's fine. I mean, it takes a lot of work, but like, I mean, that's also, I think, part of their experience, you know, like learning how to engage with a part of the media, I guess. So that's how I try to, engage with the researchers.
Another question here from Tim Horniak. Hi, Tim. Who says, he asks, how do you handle cases of science fraud? For instance, things like retraction watch. What do you do? I guess he's asking if a paper is then retracted, or whether you cover it. Perhaps that's also his question.
If it's a big enough retraction, yes. but I mean, to be frank, there's so many cases of scientific fraud that you just can't. Yeah, you have to be really choosy with those sorts of things. I mean, as a science journalist, I'm not a cheerleader for science. You know, I will write about results and whatnot and really good stories, but also I'm there to report on science itself. So if something is afoot or fraud's been uncovered, particularly in like an Australian research or university, then yeah, we would really look at that to cover, maybe even as a radio news story. But yeah, it's not something that we don't do, basically.
Yeah, Nature News definitely covers fraud or other types of wrongdoing, misconduct. If it was a big significant study that was retracted, if the original research had a lot of impact on the field. I mean, if it was just a paper that no one cited and by, you know, aren't working with lots of, you know, if it didn't have a big broad impact on the field, then we wouldn't cover it because there's just too much of it. Also, we'd sort of, you know, want to be able to do our own research and investigations to kind of find out what was going on. Was it the case of, you know, was it a sort of an accidental thing that happened, that, you know, there's not accusations of wrongdoing, or was it somehow malicious? I think, you know, we judge it based on those sorts of things.
Here about this one, I think maybe for Tomoko, about how you handle preprints. Well, maybe it's actually not for Tomoko, but in general, how should public information officers, so I'm guessing that's PIOs, that's you know, PR people for universities, how they should handle things on preprint servers, and how journalists view things on preprint servers, whether there's a healthy dose of skepticism or whether you're good to go in terms of reporting that to the community.
Yeah, preprints, skepticism. I mean, not all, you know, peer review isn't infallible. But if we see a preprint or alerted to a preprint that we think is worth covering, we'll kind of do our own peer review and just send it out to a few people and just see what they reckon. Which can be a story in itself. If you send it out to send an astronomy story out to 5 astronomers and they all say, well, that's not great, I guess that in itself is a story. But generally, most of the time we don't cover preprints. It's generally peer-reviewed science that we will cover. Yeah.
Still got
I would say that Nature News is
sorry, go on, Nicky.
Similar.
Are we okay
of
to
COVID,
conclude
maybe
in a moment, or would you like to wrap up with some?
I was going to say that I agree with everything Belinda said. You know, having a healthy dose of skepticism with preprints, but quite a bit with COVID.
A lot of questions, and we have actually reached the end of our time. I've been told we can go just a couple of minutes more, so perhaps we'll take it to 2:05. That's my time. I'm in Melbourne, and grab a few more questions from the audience, because it seems like this is a topic that is sparking people's interests. We have a question here, which I think is quite an interesting one, and this is, I guess, for Tomoko. Why do Japanese institutes feel the need to communicate in English?
Well, I mean, our universities has quite a bit of foreign students, foreign faculty, and foreign staff members. We also, the university needs to recruit talent from all over the world. So that's why we need to, promote the university in English as well. to be honest, like the website influence is very small in English, and that's something that we need to really work on. And I think some of the people who commented here talked about maybe getting the stories out, how to get the stories out. That's really a challenge. But I think gradually, I think we have been able to exposure, like on media exposure. Through social media, the effective use of social media. For example, when I do a story, I try to kind of promote it not just once, but like, 2 or 3 times by using different visuals, different, highlighting different parts of the story and try to make them look different each time. And we also try to schedule the tweets to go out, also Facebook posts to go out, like, in different time zones. So like our posts would like go out in the middle of the night sometimes, even though like the, people in Japan might be asleep. So certain, I think, through these ways, I think we've been able to increase our exposure little by little.
The argument of numbers is there's about 130 million people in the world who speak Japanese, and there's about 500 million people in the world who speak English. And so if you are trying to reach the largest possible audience, then English is a good move. Of course, you could be publishing in Hindi, and then you would probably get an audience of about 1 billion.
Or Mandarin,
yeah. Yeah. Exactly. More questions. I like this one for Tomoko again. Sorry, the other two. What are the differences between what the public wants to know and what the university wants to tell people, and how do you cope with a discrepancy?
That's one thing that we always need to keep in mind. But I think we can be quite effective. Like, for example, when I try to do a story about the university's efforts, I don't really kind of like praise or like flatter what the university has done, really. Like I would basically let researchers talk about like the shortcomings of the university, or the lacking, the places where the university lacks, for example. Like we're doing like a series of diversity features. Okay, does the university have a lot of diversity? No. Like, it's female students. We only have like, 20% of the students are female, and that's a very low percentage. And so I would acknowledge that in the stories, and I would like have researchers talk about the need for the university management to change, really. So that way, I think, people are not really listening to what the university wants to promote only. I think they also get an honest assessment of where the university is. And luckily, fortunately enough, I have had the blessing of the people around me who have been okay with the idea of getting such information out.
Constant tension really is the work of a journalist, is knowing what your audience wants to know and fending off anything else that's trying to insert itself in there. Like, I mean, the press releases that we talked about at the beginning that Belinda is deluged with, most of the time she ignores them because they're not what her audience actually wants to know. And I think that that's actually part of the role of being a journalist, is making that selection. On that note, we should probably wrap up because we are already 5 minutes over time, but I really want to thank all of our panelists for participating today. Belinda, Nicky, Tomoko, thank you very much. My name's Sara Phillips, and we will send you back to Amanda. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Otake-san, Belinda, Nicky, for that discussion. Thank you